module. That's really the essence of the kind of reuse that we want to get to with HTML5. It's great for testing as well. It means that you can test it in isolation. You know that if things are going wrong, you can pinpoint it straight down to that component. A related pattern is separating out models and views. And this is, like, again, very classic software engineering concept about separating out what represents things to the user, the business, versus how you actually view them, what they look like. There's a whole ton of frameworks that have come out in the last year or two to deal with this. And the JavaScript world has very much moved from a kind of kitchen sink approach where you would have very large frameworks like XJS or Sencha, or sorry, XJS is part of Sencha, so XJS or Sprout Core, for instance. And these were libraries that had a lot of different components like live views, data grids and so on. Very fancy, sophisticated components that you could put into your page. But the downside was there was no underlying kernel that you could pull out and just use as a general approach for building these kinds of applications. And now people have been taking these kind of core concepts. So in the case of Ember, for instance, it actually comes from Sprout Core. In other cases, they're just taking what they've been doing over the years and trying to encapsulate that as a framework. And these are very small frameworks as well. A lot of these frameworks up here are only a few kilobytes. And that's quite good. It means they're minimal. They're just enough there to structure your application. So even though they're very small, they can have a very powerful impact on how you end up developing your whole application on top of them. And they're quite different from one another as well. So it's worth actually looking into. People have done some early comparisons to talk about how they're different from each other. There's no real standard approach to this. There's a lot of opinions and a lot of different ways to do it. If you don't have time to do the evaluation, the one I'd be recommending right now is Backbone. It's probably the one that's got the most momentum and the one that you'll get the best support for, online documentation and books and so on. And there's actually going to be a conference as well on Backbone just to show how big this whole area is. And they're not just focusing on Backbone at the conference though. It's really about all this whole new area of frameworks. They're really becoming like jQuery and Dojo were a few years ago. And of course Dojo is part of this too. It's got a similar sort of framework underneath. This is how Backbone looks. If you were to create a book model with Backbone, you just create this kind of class. You say what sort of functionality you want it to have. And then you can have views that are tied to the model. So those views will actually know what model they're associated with, and they can actually deal with changes if you implement this the right way. Backbone doesn't have a whole lot of magic associated with it. You have to do a lot of that kind of handling yourself. So it's more of a convention. Say, now that I've declared this as a view, I have to deal with making sure that I'm representing any changes that happen to the model are going to immediately show up on the view. And this model view architecture, it means that you can actually have several views on the same model. So you might have a thumbnail and a full page preview of the book, and you might have a price view of the book if it's for sale, and all three will be on the page at once. And if any one of those data points change, then all three will propagate, that change will propagate from the model to change all three at once. And out here on the HTML and CSS side, you're going to have some notion of just representing that book in the user interface, and that will be closely tied to the view. So in some of those frameworks, that's all you have. The view will be basically just what you actually see inside the page, but with Backbone in particular, you do actually have a view object in the JavaScript, so you have a kind of model of what the user is actually seeing, and you can manipulate that model directly, and that will then update what's on the page. The way the views work is with templating, typically. They don't have to, but the convenient way that a lot of people are using creating views now is with this notion of templating. So if you've done this on the server side, if you use the language like PHP, which mixes code with HTML, or lots of other environments like ERB with Ruby or JSP or ASP, all of those things are basic notion of templates where they mix code inside HTML. Now what we're doing is we're doing this inside the browser. It's very much how these single page apps are generating dynamic views, constantly changing depending on what the user's doing, is they're making these new elements appear on the page, but the elements don't have to be exactly the same as each other. They can incorporate data that's represented in that model, that underlying JavaScript model, and to render it using a templating framework. So there are all these browser-side templating frameworks out there. So the way that would look here is, we have a template for a book thumbnail, and it's got variables inside it. And so when we actually pass a model through it, we say, I want a book thumbnail, but I want it representing this particular data model. Then it's going to output this particular book. And then same with model B and model C. We can pass all these data models in and get these dynamic views. That's how Backbone and Ember and all these other libraries, in one way or another, most of them are working in the same sort of basic operating paradigm based on templating. OOCS is a pattern that basically, it's kind of convention that uses CSS in an object-oriented way. And that's really how CSS was intended to be used. But the problem it's trying to get to is you end up with a single element or a single ID like this, an account object, and we're rendering it in all these different ways depending on where it appears inside the application. And it's a real mess. And Nicole Sullivan, who came up with this pattern, she actually was consulting to people like Yahoo and Facebook. And so you can imagine if you're at Facebook after all this rapid years of evolving so quickly in the hacker culture, you end up with all these different applications all over the place where people are just cutting and pasting CSS, and they're saying, well, that one looked like this, so I'll just sort of code my own version of it. It's just a complete mess from a maintainability point of view. So the way that she helped them fix it was to put these principles in place. And I'm summarizing up, you can read a lot more about it from her if you look up OOCSS. But the main principle is to use classes everywhere, right? So avoid this idea of IDs for everything. If you're using IDs, you're talking about one particular element. That doesn't scale. If you're using classes, you're talking about a whole class of element that could be repeating across all these different applications. So something like an account object, a heading, a logo, all of those things really should just have one place, one source of truth for how they look across your whole estate. And if you want to, you can then customize them, right? You can actually look at the parts that you do want to be unique. But by default, you should say as much as you can about the class in just a single class element. The other thing you'll notice here is there's no hierarchy either, right? So it's getting rid of that notion of saying, I want headings to look this way when I'm in this application, and then when they're in this tab sitting inside this window that's sitting inside this sidebar, they should look completely different. Try to avoid that. Try to cut down on those hierarchies and define things exactly where they belong. Classy HTML is a pattern I've been using that when I've started to explain to people, I've got the impression I think quite a few people are coming away and using it too, because it really simplifies your display logic. So in these single page apps, we have to make a lot of choices, right? We have these kind of user interfaces where if the user's logged in, we're going to show their email, otherwise we're going to show a login box. If the user's leaving a comment, we're going to show a text area, otherwise the text area won't be there. So we have all these little decisions all over the user interface, and the way that most programmers will deal with them is by micromanaging every one of them, right? And writing all this special code just to say what happens when you want to start editing, for instance. In this case, we're showing an item, and we're going to slide this thing down, and we're going to fade something in, and then when the user's finished, we'll roll it all back, and we'll write all the exact code again in reverse. The way you can deal with this is, again, taking advantage of what the web gives us, which is CSS. And what we can do is we can use CSS classes. And what I'm doing here is I'm actually adding a CSS class to the HTML element right at the top of the document. Every HTML single page app has a core HTML element. And effectively what I'm saying, if you look at it, if you take a step back, what I'm basically saying is this application is now in the state of editing. And because of the way CSS works, you can have rules like this, say .editing space .mixpanel. It means any mixpanel element on the page is going to inherit this style because of this notion that .editing .mixpanel means if there's an editing element that appears anywhere up before it. And so in this case, if you add something to the HTML element that's right at the start of the page, it means you can actually write these rules about how things should look when they're in that state. So you end up with something like this where you can say the mix panel by default is empty, but then we can actually add it in if it's actually in editing state. If the document or the application is in the editing state, we're going to show it. And you can use animations as well, CSS animations, which I won't go into now, to do all those fancy fading and slide up and slide down and so on. You don't need to program that either. You can use CSS transitions actually to do those effects too. We can make that a little bit cleaner too if we want. We can actually not have any rules like that inside our CSS related to specific elements like mix panel. Instead, we can declare this semantically, which again is what HTML is for, is to say this is something that we're using for editing, and then later on we just have a general rule. And that means anyone who is creating the HTML, all they have to do is just mark it as for editing, and that will only show when the user's in editing mode. So I'm going to finish up there. We've gone through the 3 phases of your application, hopefully. A few resources for you. Looking to dive into HTML, it's an entirely open source free book that you can see on the web, diveintohtml.info. I recommend Mozilla Developer Network as a great resource for lots of data, not just about the Mozilla Firefox browser, but also just about all the browsers. It's a wiki that a lot of the different browser vendors contribute to make sure that it's got the latest information about all of the browsers. HTML5 rocks, a little bit biased, it's a site I used to contribute to. It's got loads of tutorials and references, as well as a great overview of HTML5 slideshow, which they actually keep up to date, so whenever you go there you'll find all the latest features of HTML5. And if you go to this URL, it's a shortcut, isgood/front-end feeds. That's actually a Google Reader aggregation of 300 very well-known HTML5 JavaScript blogs. It's like a master feed of all of them. Look into these books if you're doing some more advanced JavaScript. It's really worth knowing some of the patterns that people have derived to do these kind of high-scale architectures. Adi Osmani has really got the very latest documentation for this. He's keeping this up to date. It's called Patterns for Large-Scale JavaScript, and it's kind of book for the kind of model view, controller issues I talked about, templating, backbone, all those sorts of things. Adi Osmani has got a really nice collection of tutorial and resource information for that. He also maintains a kind of set of comparison applications as well. So he actually shows you how all of these different frameworks will implement the same application. And finally, Nicholas Sakis, check out his slideshows on scalable JavaScript architecture as well. So I think I'll leave it there. And if you've got questions, I think we can first actually, I think you're going to talk about, so yeah, we'll have Daniel talk about encapsulator, and then we can take questions after that.
I'll do that really briefly, just because the slides here on this computer.